The first thing I would say is that folks should listen to the podcast themselves and make up their own mind. And that's the beauty of a democracy. It's a 3-hour-long interview, Douglas. It's fascinating. Both of these blokes have opinions. Why are the establishment trying to censor their opinions?
Well, I'm not sure it's just the establishment. This letter of 270 medical professionals was first of all billed as being a letter signed by 270 medical professionals, turned out to be a number of doctors, a number of people doing PhDs, a number of people who were studying medicine or had met someone who was studying medicine, and a few people who'd gone to the doctor with a cough at some point. I mean, it was a classic example of one of these mass letters that falls apart on first inquiry. What the letter writers are trying to do is what quite a lot of people have been trying to do in recent months and in these years, which is to try to rein in the significant impression that Joe Rogan makes across the planet. You know, Joe is an extraordinary phenomenon because in an era where the media were repeatedly retreating to smaller and smaller sound bites, so that an average BBC segment might last 3 minutes between two people, giving everyone about 50 seconds of airtime in total. Podcasters like Joe Rogan went exactly the opposite way. They said, actually, if these things are worth looking at, they're worth looking at in depth. And so he invites experts of many different views onto his podcast, and he talks with them, as you say, for 2-3 hours at a time, and it finds a massive global audience. Of course, there are people that are upset by that. There are always going to be people upset by everything. But there's no way, in my view, that they've got any chance of cancelling Joe Rogan.
No, but it's fascinating, isn't it, Douglas, because Spotify is one of those uber woke Californian-type companies. I mean, I know it's a Swedish company, but many of their staff are now headquartered in California. They, of course, hire the Duke and Duchess of woke themselves, Harry and Meghan. So it'll be interesting to see how they react and if they do stand strong. But I do agree. I think Rogan is probably uncancelable.
You can't sign a $100 million contract with somebody and then who's known for a diversity of opinion and inviting a diverse group of guests on and then sort of take his podcast off your platform because he's invited people with opinions that are, you know, to a great extent in America being pushed to the margins. And Joe Rogan's role in that is to say, let's look at these opinions. They may well be of interest. They clearly are of interest to very many people.
No, I agree. And actually, Douglas, if you look at the US media at the moment, the folk who are having to eat their words are the establishment types who used to appear on channels like CNN and are having to admit they got many aspects of this pandemic completely wrong.
The other thing, exactly. And you see, this gets to one of the hearts of the whole issue with Rogan's rise to fame and many other things going on underneath us at the moment, which is that these entities like CNN once had a great reputation and people did respect them. It's just not the case anymore. All of our sense-making apparatus of that kind, one by one in recent years, lost the trust of the public for all sorts of reasons, you might say. But they lost that trust. And so when they then come down, as they do repeatedly at CNN, very hard on Joe Rogan and say this man's perpetrating fake news, I'm afraid that the American public in particular think, well, we don't trust CNN. And Joe Rogan's viewing figures show that he's doing an awful lot better than CNN these days.
And Douglas, you have been a guest of Joe Rogan. Mm-hmm. My impression is that he is genuinely intellectually curious. Unlike most journalists of his time, he is prepared to admit that he doesn't know everything. He's prepared to be guided by various experts. And I think that's why people engage with them, because they genuinely see the way that he consumes information and disseminates.
He's genuinely open-minded. I've done his show a number of times. I know him. He's genuinely open-minded. He's not a doctrinaire type. He doesn't come at everything with a specific, rigid ideological framework. I think a lot of people like that. Clearly, a lot of people like that. And the other thing is that he does something which, again, CNN and so on just will not do. He invites people on who will correct him and disagree with him. In fact, it happened just last week. A friend of mine from Down Under, Josh Steps, was on Joe Rogan's podcast, and he corrected something on air that he said that he thought Joe Rogan had got wrong, and they went around it. You do not get that on the mainstream media these days, where whole reputations are reliant on people's alleged omniscience never being challenged. Joe Rogan doesn't go along with that, as he said to me before. He's a cage fighter dude. That's how he started off. He got interested in all the interesting things that are going on in our time, and he speaks for and speaks to people, for just millions of people around the world. And I'm just always surprised that the mainstream media doesn't try to learn from his success and doesn't try to take any lessons from that, and instead says repeatedly, basically, let's see if we can trounce this guy and snuff him out, and if we need to call in 270 people who can pretend they're doctors, then that'll do as well to help us.